Hello everyone and welcome back. If you're a Delhi University student in semester 6 preparing for your research methodology examination, then this video is especially for you. This video is also available for your convenience in Hindi, so please check that out as well. Today we'll cover 4 of the most important and most frequently misunderstood topics in the syllabus: the research gap, problem, question, scope, flow, plagiarism, literature review, and George Orwell's essay Politics and the English Language. These topics appear regularly in previous year papers and are essential for both short and long answer questions. Let's get started. Let's begin with a concept that many students get wrong in examinations. Students often treat research gap, research problem, research question, and scope as 4 separate definitions that need to be memorized. In reality, they are part of a single research process. Each stage naturally leads to the next. Think of it as a chain. First, you identify a research gap. Then you convert that gap into a research problem. From the problem, you formulate a research question. Finally, you define the scope and limitations of your study. Let's look at an example. Imagine that you are reading existing research on mental health among young people in India. After reviewing several studies, you notice that most researchers focus on college students living in large metropolitan cities. However, very little research exists on school students in tier 2 cities. This missing area of knowledge is your research gap. A research gap simply tells us that something important has not yet been adequately studied. However, identifying a gap is not enough. You must explain why this gap matters. This becomes your research problem. For example, quote, the lack of research on mental health among school students in tier 2 cities means that policymakers and educators lack sufficient information to design effective interventions. Notice that this statement explains both what is missing and why it is important. Once you have identified the problem, you narrow it down into a specific and answerable question. This becomes your research question. For example, what are the primary mental health challenges faced by students in classes 9th to 12th in tier 2 Indian cities? This question is focused, researchable, and directly connected to the problem. Finally, you define the scope and limitations of your study. The scope explains what your research will cover. For example, you may decide to study students from 3 schools in Lucknow over a 6-month period. The limitations explain what your study cannot cover and why. Examples might include a small sample size, dependence on self-reported information, or the absence of professional clinical diagnosis. A simple way to remember the sequence is: first research gap, then research problem, then research questions, and finally scope and limitations. A gap identifies what is missing. A problem explains why it matters. A question asks what needs to be investigated. Scope and limitations define the boundaries of the study. Exam ready definitions. Research gap: a topic, perspective, population, or time period that has not been adequately studied in existing literature. Research problem: a clear statement explaining what needs to be investigated and why it is important. Research question: a focused and answerable question that guides the entire research project. Scope: the boundaries of the study, including time frame, location, population, and variables. Limitations: constraints that may affect the findings, such as limited access, sample size, or methodological restrictions. Remember, limitations are not excuses. They demonstrate academic honesty and transparency. Now let's discuss plagiarism. This is one of the most commonly asked topics in research methodology examinations. Plagiarism occurs when someone presents another person's words, ideas, arguments, or data as their own without giving proper credit. It is considered a serious form of academic dishonesty. There are 4 major types of plagiarism that you should know for your exam. First is direct plagiarism. This is the most obvious form. It occurs when someone copies text word for word from a source without using quotation marks or citations. In simple terms, it is a straightforward copy and paste plagiarism. Second, mosaic or patchwork plagiarism. This form is most subtle. Instead of copying an entire paragraph, the writer takes phrases and sentences from multiple sources, changes a few words, and combines them into a new text. Although the wording may be slightly different, the structure and idea still belong to someone else. Therefore, it remains plagiarism. Type 3. Accidental plagiarism. This occurs unintentionally. Examples include forgetting to provide citation, using quotation marks incorrectly, or paraphrasing too closely to the original source. Even though there is no intention to deceive, it is still considered plagiarism. Type 4. Self-plagiarism. Many students are surprised by this category. Self-plagiarism occurs when a writer reuses their own previously submitted work without disclosure. For example, submitting the same assignment in two different courses would be considered self-plagiarism. How to avoid plagiarism? Always cite your sources properly. Use quotation marks whenever you quote directly. Paraphrase carefully by changing both the wordings and the sentence structure. Keep detailed records of all sources during the research process. Finally, use plagiarism detection software such as Turnitin or Grammarly to check your work before submission. A useful memory trick. Direct plagiarism is copying. Mosaic plagiarism is stitching together borrowed material. Accidental plagiarism is citation mistakes. And self-plagiarism is reusing your own work without disclosure. Now let's move on to literature review. This is one of the most important concepts in research and appears almost every year in examinations. Many students confuse a literature review with a bibliography or a collection of summaries. A literature review is much more than that. A literature review is a crucial and analytical survey of existing research on a topic. It examines what previous researchers have studied, what they discovered, where they agree, where they disagree, and what remains unexplored. The literature review serves three major purposes. First, establish context. It demonstrates that you understand the existing field of research and are familiar with important studies. Second, identify the research gap. The literature review is where the research gap emerges. By reviewing previous scholarship, you can identify areas that have been neglected or insufficiently studied. Third, justify your research. If previous studies have already answered your question completely, there is no need for another study. A literature review helps demonstrate why your research is still necessary. Structure of a literature review. A typical literature review contains three parts: introduction, body, and conclusion. Introduction: the topic and explain what body of literature is being reviewed. Body: discuss the sources either thematically or chronologically, compare findings, identify patterns, and highlight disagreements. Conclusion: summarize the major findings and clearly identify the research gap that your study will address. Common mistakes. Many students write, author A said this, author B said that, author C said something else. That is not literature review. That is merely annotation or summary. A true literature review synthesizes information. It identifies patterns, tensions, debates, and gaps across multiple sources. Remember, a literature review is not a list of summaries. It is a conversation between sources. George Orwell's famous essay, Politics and the English Language, published in 1946. This is one of the prescribed readings in your syllabus and is frequently asked in examinations. Orwell's central argument is simple but powerful. Poor writing is not merely a stylistic problem. It is also a political and intellectual problem. When language becomes vague, inflated, and imprecise, it conceals weak thinking and makes manipulation easier. According to Orwell, bad writing often suffers from two major problems. The first is the use of state imagery, including cliches and worn-out metaphors. The second is a lack of precision, where writers choose abstract or complicated words instead of clear and direct language. To improve writing, Orwell proposes 6 famous rules. First, a metaphor, simile, or figure of speech that you are accustomed to seeing in print. Second, never use a long word where a short word will do. Third, if it is possible to remove a word, always remove it. 4. Never use the passive voice when the active voice is available. 5th, never use a foreign phrase, scientific term, or jargon word if any everyday English equivalent exists. And break any of these rules rather than saying something outright barbarous. Important for research methodology. Academic writing often violates Orwell's principles. Students frequently use unnecessary jargons, excessive passive constructions, and overly complex vocabulary. Orwell reminds us that clear thinking produces clear writing. Good academic writing should be direct, precise, and honest. In many ways, Orwell's essay is a guide to intellectual integrity through language. Now let's do a quick recap of today's discussions. Research begins with a gap, which leads to a problem, then a question, and finally scope and limitations. Plagiarism has 4 major forms: direct, mosaic, accidental, and self-plagiarism. A literature review is not a collection of summaries, it is a process of synthesis and critical analysis. And George Orwell's 6 rules provide a practical guide for clear and effective academic writing. In the next video, continue with research proposal versus research papers, annotated bibliography, primary and secondary sources, abstract and MLS citation styles. Make sure you watch the video as well. If you found this revision useful, please like, share and subscribe to the channel. Again, this same video is available for you in Hindi as well, so please make sure to check that out. And we'll see you again in the next video.